ancient times, being a healer wasn't a noble path, it was a gamble. A constant dance with death. You weren't just treating wounds. You were expected to battle spirits, appease angry gods, and sometimes face the wrath of your own people when things went wrong. Before science, before microscopes, before the very concept of bacteria, healers had to rely on instincts, stories, rituals, and whatever scraps of herbal knowledge had been passed down. Imagine trying to cure a deadly infection without knowing what an infection even is. Now imagine the pressure of failure. A single death could mark you as a fraud, or worse, a witch. Many ancient healers ended up not just discredited, but executed. Hanged, drowned, or burned, simply for trying to help. But where did this fear come from? Why was healing, of all things, so dangerous? Let's go back. Not to the Renaissance, not even to ancient Greece, but further, to the first moments humans looked at sickness and wondered. Why? To the early tribes, disease wasn't biological, it was personal. If someone fell ill, it meant something. Curse, punishment, a breach of taboo. Healing wasn't just medical, it was moral. A test of faith, of loyalty, of spiritual cleanliness. And you, as the healer, had to read those invisible signs. You had to know the story behind the cough. Was it a demon sent by a rival clan? Was it the consequence of a broken oath? Was it a sign that the spirits were angry? And worse, was it contagious? But the word contagious didn't exist yet. People only saw what they could observe. And when one person got sick and then another, the suspicion didn't fall on a virus. It fell on you. What had you done wrong? Even the tools of the healer were feared. Strange herbs, powders, animal bones, incantations whispered into the dark. To the untrained eye, this looked like sorcery. And when fear spread faster than the illness, it turned deadly. Healers walked a razor's edge. In ancient Mesopotamia, they split healers into two kinds. The Ashipu, who worked with magic, and the Asu, who used practical remedies. But to the people, both were mysterious. Both held power. And power, in a time of ignorance, was a dangerous thing to hold. If you healed someone, you were praised. If you failed, you were blamed. And failure was inevitable. There were no antibiotics, no sterilization, no understanding of how diseases worked. The human body was a mystery, and most treatments were guesswork. Bloodletting, leeches, drinking mercury, rubbing dung into wounds. In hindsight, it's horrifying. But at the time, it was the only hope. Now imagine being that hope. The healer didn't just bear the weight of one life. They bore the weight of belief. If the sick died, it wasn't just seen as a natural end, it was a moral collapse. Cosmic failure. People didn't mourn quietly. They demanded answers. And they often demanded blood. In Africa, in Asia, in Europe, stories abound of healers being turned on by their own communities. Accused of curses they were trying to lift. Murdered for diseases they were trying to cure. The same hands that healed could be seen as the cause of death. Because fear doesn't ask for logic. It asks for someone to blame. But let's pause for a second. Because it wasn't all darkness. In many places, healers were respected. Revered even. Shamans, herbalists, midwives, they held unique roles in society. They were the bridge between the physical and the spiritual. The only ones who dared enter that space between life and death. And that space was terrifying. What if a person didn't recover? What if a child stopped breathing? What if a mother bled out during childbirth? You couldn't say it was a medical complication. You had to answer to the gods, to the spirits, to the tribe. You had to explain the unexplainable and risk your life doing it. And if you made the wrong call, the price was paid in flesh. There's a story told in the highlands of Peru. A healer once treated a chieftain's son who'd fallen from a cliff, his legs shattered, his breathing weak. The healer prepared a poultice of crushed coca leaves and chanted through the night. The next morning, the boy was dead. By noon, the healer was tied to a stake. They said he'd offended the mountain spirits, that his herbs were too bitter, that he'd spoken the wrong words in his ritual. There was no mercy, no investigation, just judgment and flame. But what else could they do? They didn't have the luxury of science. They didn't have time to test theories or run controlled trials. All they had was urgency and fear, and this wasn't just the fate of tribal healers. Even in ancient civilizations like Egypt, Greece, and Rome, healers were often on the edge of admiration and suspicion. Take Imhotep, one of the earliest recorded physicians in history. He was so revered that centuries later, he was worshipped as a god. But not every healer earned divinity. Most lived with the constant risk of disgrace or execution if their treatments failed too often or too spectacularly. Even Hippocrates, the so-called father of modern medicine, lived in a time when physicians were viewed as barely more trustworthy than charlatans. His revolutionary ideas, like the theory that disease came from natural causes rather than divine punishment, were controversial. Dangerous, even, because to say that sickness wasn't the work of the gods was almost blasphemy. The real terror was this: the healer was often alone in their knowledge. There were no universities, no peer-reviewed journals. What you knew came from fragments, oral tradition, carved tablets, whispered secrets. And when something new happened, a plague, a strange wound, a sudden madness, you had to improvise, with no guarantee you'd live to see if your guess was right. And plagues, they changed everything. Imagine the Black Death. Bodies stacked in carts. Entire towns emptied. The air thick with the scent of death. In the 14th century, healers wore terrifying bird-like masks filled with herbs, believing the scent would ward off bad air. They didn't understand bacteria. They thought disease floated in miasmas, poisonous fogs. So they prescribed incense, burning sulfur, bleeding the patient until they were too weak to move. And when those patients died, guess who people turned on? The healer. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine wise men and women with calming voices and miracle hands. But the truth was bloodier, lonelier, and far more desperate. Healers were often forced to work in secret, to perform surgeries in candlelit rooms with no anesthesia, no knowledge of infection, and no second chances. Sometimes they succeeded. More often they didn't, but they kept going. Why? Because someone had to. No matter the risk, no matter the superstition, no matter the cost. Someone had to stand between the sick and the grave. Someone had to try, and yet the toll was immense. Healers didn't just suffer the wrath of failure. They carried the emotional weight of every death. Every child they couldn't save. Every mother they watched bleed out. Every patient who looked at them with pleading eyes, then went still. There were no therapists for the ancient healer. No support groups. Only silence. And the haunting question: did I do enough? Let's talk about knowledge or the lack of it. In ancient India, texts like the Charaka Samhita laid out elaborate theories of health, including the balance of three dashas: Veda, Pitta, and Kapha. It was a complex system that tried to make sense of illness through patterns and observation. But it still couldn't answer the fundamental question: why do some live and others die? In China, traditional Chinese medicine traced disease through meridians and qi, the life energy believed to flow through the body. Acupuncture, herbal remedies, pressure points. It worked sometimes, but not always. And every failure fed suspicion. You could spend your life studying herbs, roots, pressure points, body fluids, and still lose your patience. Still be blamed. Still be killed. Because the greatest burden of the ancient healer was that their failures were public. Their successes, forgotten. When the fever broke, it was a miracle. When the patient died, it was your fault. Healers were expected to know everything. To diagnose without tools. To treat without medicine, to restore hope in hopeless places. But they were still human, and their greatest enemy wasn't always disease. Sometimes it was the people they tried to save. There's something deeply tragic in that. The healer, armed with little more than intuition and courage, becomes both savior and scapegoat. If the patient recovers, it's the gods who are thanked. If the patient dies, the healer takes the fall. And yet, despite this, people still chose to become healers. Why? Maybe it was a calling. Maybe it was the legacy of a parent or a mentor. Or maybe it was necessity. In small communities, someone had to step up. Someone had to learn what plant eased a fever, what root could dull pain, what ritual calmed a frightened soul. And once you knew, you couldn't unknow. You became the one everyone turned to, especially when things went dark. But darkness wasn't just metaphorical. In some cultures, healing was linked directly to the underworld. You had to traverse spiritual realms, communicate with ancestors, read omens in the entrails of animals, or interpret dreams. These weren't just ceremonies, they were obligations. Failing to perform them correctly could mean disaster. And when disaster struck, no one asked if the patient was too sick to save. They asked what the healer had done wrong. Even physical signs of illness were misunderstood. Seizures were seen as possession, skin lesions as divine punishment. Mental illness, if even recognized, was often treated with isolation, exorcism, or chains. There was no distinction between body and soul, medicine and magic. You didn't treat the disease. You treated the whole fate of a person, and sometimes the whole village. Let's look at ancient Rome. Galen, one of the most influential physicians of his time, treated emperors and gladiators alike. He advanced theories of anatomy, developed surgical techniques, and documented his observations in volumes that would influence medicine for centuries. But even Galen made critical errors. He dissected animals, not humans, and so many of his anatomical assumptions were wrong. His mistakes persisted for over 1,000 years, unchallenged, because to question a healer's teachings was to question the foundations of medicine itself. That's the irony. In a world where healers were often distrusted, once a healer gained authority, their word became law. And that made things worse, because now dogma replaced discovery. Innovation became heresy. The healer's struggle didn't end with survival. It extended into legacy. What you taught could be repeated for generations, even if it was wrong. Even if it killed people. Imagine the pressure. Every method you pass down might shape the fate of countless lives. Yet you have no microscope, no clinical trial, just experience, observation, and faith. And that faith could be fragile. If your remedies failed too many times, people would stop coming. You'd lose your status, your protection. And in ancient times, that often meant losing your life. But there was another danger: envy. A successful healer could earn respect, wealth, even political influence. And that made them a threat. Stories tell of rival healers accusing each other of witchcraft, of kings turning on their own physicians out of paranoia, of midwives poisoned, shamans exiled, herbalists imprisoned, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. In medieval Europe, thousands of women were burned as witches. Many were midwives, healers, women who understood plants, who knew how to ease childbirth or treat fevers. But to a frightened society, their knowledge was unnatural, suspicious, evil. Their real crime, knowing more than they should. The healer's mind was a library of secrets. Some were benign, others dangerous. Which plants kill and which ones heal. Which words comfort and which ones stir fear. Which rituals bring peace and which awaken suspicion. To be a healer was to walk with knowledge through a world built on fear. And fear doesn't care about intention. In Japan, the onmyoji were imperial court healers and diviners who wielded enormous power. They predicted disasters, conducted exorcisms, and advised emperors. But when fortunes changed or disaster struck, they were often the first to be blamed. In Central Africa, among the Fang people, the Nana, part healer, part diviner, was both revered and feared. Their work included treating illness, but also uncovering witches. It was a deadly game of suspicion, where a single accusation could flip roles in an instant. Healer one day, condemned the next. The deeper you go into history, the more you see this repeated pattern. A society desperate for answers, turning to healers for hope, and turning on them when that hope runs out. And yet, somehow, the tradition survived, because people always get sick, and someone always has to try to help. But helping didn't always look the way we imagine it now. Sometimes, healing was a performance. In ancient rituals, the healer often had to put on a show. Dancing, chanting, calling upon the spirits. The patient and the entire community needed to see that something was being done. The drama of healing was sometimes more important than the remedy itself, because belief could be more powerful than medicine. And when all else failed, hope had to be manufactured. You see this across cultures. A sick child? Surround them with candles, paint symbols on the floor, burn herbs to smoke out the evil spirit. A warrior struck in battle? Sing his ancestors' names as you clean the wound with wine. A woman struggling in childbirth? Whisper prayers while tying knots in a cord to transfer the pain. The rituals might not cure, but they gave the illusion of control. And in a world where disease struck without warning, that illusion was everything. But what about when healers really did help? That's where things get complicated. Because some treatments worked. Herbal remedies, bone setting, wound cleaning, these weren't just myths. They were passed down because they had results. A bark that reduced fever. A poultice that stopped bleeding. A compress that soothed pain. But even success could be dangerous. If you healed someone others couldn't, suspicion followed. Why you? What do you know? Who taught you? Are you gifted or cursed? And if you didn't share your secrets, people grew nervous. But if you did share them, others might steal them. Or worse, use them against you. So many healers kept their knowledge hidden. Passed down only to their children. Guarded like treasure. Because in a world without patents, your skill was your survival. Lose it and you were no one. Now picture a healer in the Arctic among the Inuit. He kneels beside a fevered elder, grinding dried moss into a bitter tea. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, the others sit silent, watching. If the elder dies, the healer will be blamed. If he lives, the healer may be seen as favored by spirits. And that, too, can be dangerous. Power attracts fear, and fear attracts violence. It's not just the patient's life on the line. It's the healer's. That's the invisible wound of ancient medicine. The trauma. Healers witnessed pain and death constantly. They saw children gasp their last breath. Lovers die in each other's arms. Warriors scream through amputations. Women hemorrhaging in childbirth. And they had no sedatives, no protective gear, no hospital walls, only memory, and they carried those memories like scars. There was no place to put the grief, no space to collapse. You had to keep moving. The next person was already sick. The next body already shaking. And if you cried, people might think you'd lost your power, that you were weak, that you'd opened a door to bad spirits. So you held it in, and that holding in time broke many. It's no wonder some healers turned bitter, cold, harsh, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't afford to. Caring too much could destroy you, and yet, somehow they endured. The legacy of healing passed through fire and blood, through superstition and accusation, through centuries of trial and error. The path to modern medicine is paved with their sacrifices. Not just the ones who succeeded, but the ones who tried, who failed, who paid the price. Their names are mostly lost, their graves unmarked, their tools rotted, but their impact impossible to erase. Because behind every vaccine, every surgery, every hospital protocol, there's a chain of trial and terror that began long before anyone understood what a germ was. It began with people who looked at suffering and decided to stand between it and the grave. But to truly understand the weight carried by ancient healers, you have to see the world through their eyes. Imagine this: you're a healer in a mountain village. A woman is brought to you, limp in her brother's arms. Her lips are blue, her breath shallow, her belly distended. The villagers whisper. Someone cursed her, they say. Maybe it's envy. Maybe she looked at the wrong man. Maybe the spirits are angry. You check her pulse, feel her skin. You smell infection, but you don't have that word. All you know is something inside her is rotting. And there's nothing in your pouch of herbs strong enough to stop it. You can give her warmth, prayers, pain relief, maybe, but you know she's not going to make it. And when she dies, they'll look at you, not with gratitude for trying, but with suspicion. And maybe next time they'll go to someone else. Or worse, maybe they'll say you caused it, that you touched her spirit wrong, that your energy has turned. You don't sleep that night. You never really do, because being a healer means you live with the dying. And the dying don't always go quietly. Now consider another time, another place. Ancient Mesopotamia. Clay tablets record spells and symptoms side by side. A headache could mean too much heat in the body, or an angry demon trapped in the skull. Treatments varied accordingly. A poultice of crushed figs, a ritual chant. A sacrifice. To modern minds, it sounds like chaos. But there was a logic in it, a sacred order. Healers were navigating not just physical illness but the balance between the human and divine. To treat the body, they had to understand the gods. But gods are fickle. And when prayers failed, it wasn't just the patient who suffered. The healer's own life could be forfeit. In many cultures, a healer's success was tied to their moral purity. A healer who lied, sinned, or became jealous could lose their healing power, or so it was believed. So healers had to live not just wisely, but blamelessly. A single misstep could discredit everything they knew. Healing, in that sense, wasn't a profession. It was a spiritual burden. And it isolated you. You weren't quite part of the village anymore. People came to you when they were desperate, but avoided you when they were well. You were too close to sickness, to death. Children were warned not to follow you. Men didn't speak casually with you. Women whispered about you behind doors. To carry the knowledge of life and death was to live in exile. Quiet, respected, feared, but still needed. And that's the paradox of the ancient healer. You could be hated, but no one wanted to lose you, because every community knew, one outbreak, one accident, one bad winter, and you were all they had. Even your tools betrayed that loneliness. There were no sterile instruments, no surgical gloves, no modern diagnostic tools. You worked with sharpened stones, bone needles, fire. Your hands became your instruments, your senses your tests. You smelled decay. You tasted bitter herbs. You listened to breath and heartbeat with nothing but your own ears. And you made decisions, irreversible ones, based on what you felt in your gut. A swollen wound, a rattling cough, a child convulsing. You had seconds to act. No scans, no second opinions. Just you. And maybe the gods, if they were listening. But what if they weren't? What if the gods were silent? What if your herbs failed? What if the bleeding didn't stop? What then? You couldn't admit defeat. You had to perform confidence. Fake certainty. Because if you faltered, so did everyone else's hope. Healers became actors, stoics, martyrs, and still they endured. Enduring wasn't just about survival, it was about adapting. And over time, healers did adapt. They became observers, listeners, pattern seekers. They learned from failure quietly over generations. What herbs soothed a cough, what roots stopped bleeding, what leaves caused vomiting, what bark brought sleep. Without labs, they conducted experiments in real life, every patient a test, every death a data point, and through those painful lessons, primitive medicine evolved. In ancient China, healers developed an entire system of diagnosis based on pulse, tongue color, and energy flow. They mapped invisible currents through the body, meridians, long before Western science had a name for nerves or circulation. Their methods weren't perfect, but they worked well enough to keep being passed on. In India, Ayurvedic healers categorized the body by humors and doshas. They believed balance was key not just of body but of mind and soul. They understood digestion, sleep, seasonal rhythms. Their system wasn't rooted in modern biology, but it was holistic, methodical, and surprisingly effective in many cases. In the Americas, indigenous healers knew the land intimately. They used hundreds of plants for wounds, infections, pain, childbirth, and spiritual rituals. They watched how animals treated themselves, what leaves a bear ate when sick, what clay birds used to cleanse, and learned by mimicking the natural world. They had no degrees, no licenses, no charts. But they had knowledge, hard-earned, paid for in time, pain, and loss. And here's the irony that echoes through time. While today we praise science and dismiss magic, many of those ancient healers blurred the lines between the two, and that's why they were effective. They treated both the body and the belief, because belief mattered. A placebo? That's just a modern word for an ancient truth. People often need to believe they're healing before their bodies can begin to repair. Healers knew this instinctively. That's why they spoke with confidence. Why they used smells, sounds, fire, smoke, color, chants. Healing wasn't just chemical, it was theater. And in the absence of certainty, performance was part of the cure. But not all performances ended well. Some went too far. Into manipulation, into control, into false promises and snake oil. And just like today, ancient societies had their share of frauds. Charlatans who preyed on fear, who sold nonsense as medicine, who profited from pain without accountability. And those frauds made it harder for the real healers, the ones who actually helped. Because every time someone died from a fake cure, trust in all healers weakened. It became a dangerous balance. If you were too humble, people ignored you. If you were too bold, they feared you. If you failed, you were cursed. If you succeeded too often, they called you unnatural. There was no safe ground, no comfortable middle. Being a healer meant walking a tightrope between hope and terror with no safety net. And still, people did it. Again and again. Century after century. Why? Maybe because healing, at its core, isn't about glory, or wealth, or even success. It's about witnessing suffering and choosing not to look away. It's about stepping into the fire when everyone else backs away. And in ancient times, that fire burned hotter than we can imagine. Let's go deeper. Because the struggle wasn't only external. It wasn't just the villagers, the spirits, the politics. It was internal, too. The healer carried doubt. Heavy, gnawing doubt. What if the remedy fails? What if the child dies screaming? What if the gods are silent? What if this time, I can't fix it? And there was no one to confide in. No therapist. No support group. You were the support. The counselor. The last hope. You didn't get to break down. You just buried it. Like everyone else buried their dead. Imagine that pressure over years. Over decades. Imagine being the person everyone calls when the pain starts, but no one visits when the crisis passes. You fade back into the shadows, until the next cry for help drags you out again. That isolation could crush people. Some healers turned to spirits for comfort. Others to alcohol or solitude or rituals of control. Some simply hardened, emotionally numb to suffering. Not because they stopped caring, but because caring too much meant drowning. And yet, despite all that, many found meaning in the work. Even joy. Saving a life, watching fever break, seeing a mother hold her child again, that was a kind of miracle. And in a world starved for miracles, being the one to deliver one, even rarely, could keep you going. But not everyone wanted you to keep going. Because healing was power. And in ancient times, power was dangerous. In royal courts, healers were close to rulers. Too close, sometimes. They knew secrets. They saw kings at their weakest, sick, bleeding, hallucinating, dying. And that made them a threat that needed watching. Some were executed for giving the wrong treatment. Others poisoned by jealous rivals. Some accused of using their knowledge for manipulation, of whispering into a ruler's ear, bending policy through medicine. A healer's influence could topple armies or disappear overnight. That paranoia shaped the way medicine developed. Healers began keeping their methods secret or wrapping them in layers of religion to protect themselves. Others clung to authority by aligning with priesthoods or powerful families. But true independence? That was rare, and still is, because medicine, even today, is never just about the body. It's about belief. And belief is messy, emotional, political. In ancient times, a healer was expected to act with the certainty of a god, but live with the fragility of a human. That contradiction left scars. And not just metaphorical ones. Many healers experimented on themselves. They drank their own potions, applied their own treatments, let insects bite them, endured pain to understand it. Not out of recklessness, but out of desperation to learn. Because they couldn't ask others to suffer without suffering first. That level of sacrifice is hard to comprehend now. But it's part of the lineage of medicine. A lineage built not only on science, but on pain, isolation, trial, and instinct. We like to think of progress as a straight line. But healing was never linear. It was circular. A spiral of discovery and forgetting, of breakthroughs and burnings, of truth and myth tangled like roots underground. And through it all, the healer remained. Not perfect, not powerful, but present. But presence alone wasn't always enough. In ancient Egypt, healers held titles like chief of physicians, and some worked directly under pharaohs. Their knowledge was extensive: herbs, anatomy from mummification, surgical procedures. They even had specialized doctors for different parts of the body. Yet even in that advanced world, they fought shadows. If a treatment failed, it might be seen as a betrayal not just of the body but of cosmic balance, of Ma'at. A healer didn't just battle disease. They were guardians of harmony. And if harmony broke, punishment followed. Sometimes that meant exile. Sometimes execution. Sometimes a quiet disappearance in the night. So even the most educated walked on eggshells. And in less structured societies, the dangers were even more immediate. Picture the healer in a Celtic tribe. Their remedies are a mix of herbs, chants, and sacred stones. They tend to wounds with moss and honey, stitch gashes with animal sinew. They invoke nature spirits to guide their hand. But when the chieftain's son dies of infection, no one remembers the 10 others the healer saved. They remember the one they lost. And grief becomes rage. So the healer must flee, vanish into the woods, change their name, start again somewhere no one knows their face. This wasn't rare. It was the cost of trying. The world didn't understand failure because it didn't understand disease. Illness was never random in their eyes. Someone or something had to be responsible. If it wasn't a curse, it was you. In many cultures, especially during plagues or outbreaks, healers became scapegoats, accused of summoning the illness they failed to stop, burned as witches, buried alive, beheaded. History is soaked in the blood of those who tried to heal too close to fear. And even when you weren't killed, you were still hunted, in rumors, in suspicion, in sideways glances. So the question becomes, why did anyone become a healer? Why risk everything for people who might turn on you? The answer is never simple. Some inherited the role, born into it, trained since childhood. For them, it wasn't a choice, it was duty. Others felt called, after watching a loved one suffer, or surviving illness themselves. They decided no one should endure what they had. And some were simply wired that way, to run toward the scream instead of away, to sit by the bedside when others fled, to try again and again despite the odds. And that's something worth remembering. Because in every generation, every village, every forgotten corner of the world, there were those who chose to heal anyway, chose the burden, chose the risk, chose the loneliness. They didn't have textbooks. They didn't have clean tools. They didn't have a support system, but they had courage. And in the end, that courage is what carried healing forward, step by brutal step, into the light. Let's take a moment to imagine what healing actually looked like on an ordinary day for someone in the ancient world. Not the dramatic battles with plagues or curses, just a regular day. A child falls from a tree. A bone snaps. You, the healer, are summoned. You don't have x-rays. You don't have anesthetics. You don't even have proper sanitation. What you do have is experience. You've seen this before once or twice. You know how the leg should look. You feel the position of the break with your fingers. The child screams, and the mother's face goes pale. But you must stay calm. You prepare strips of bark. Boil them. You splint the leg with carved sticks. Wrap it tight with softened leather, soaked in medicinal paste to keep infection away. You say words not because you believe in magic, but because they do. And belief is part of the medicine. You tell the child to rest. You tell the family to keep the limb still. And then you leave. But you don't leave it behind. You carry the worry with you. You know how easily the wound can go bad. One fever. One cut reopened. One bite from an insect. You think of it as you fall asleep. You think of it when you wake up. Because the line between life and death is always that thin. Now multiply that by hundreds of patients. Wounds, births, fevers, poisonings, miscarriages, bites, burns, pains no one can explain. No break, no vacation, no retreat from responsibility. Every village needs a healer, but only one. You are it. And if you die, they're lost. That pressure, it shapes you. Some healers became hardened, even cruel, to distance themselves from the weight of constant suffering. Others became deeply spiritual, needing to believe there was a higher purpose behind the pain. And some just broke, quietly, disappearing into madness or silence or isolation. And yet, the healer's role continued, passed down, reinvented, reborn in every generation. Across continents, this pattern repeated itself. In the frozen north, shamans chewed bitter roots and summoned ancestral spirits to guide their hands through healing rituals. In the deserts, Bedouin herbalists blended oils and resins passed down orally for centuries, tracking illness like storytellers through time. In sub-Saharan Africa, knowledge was sung. Healing songs, rhythms, dances, each with a purpose. Not just to comfort the patient, but to align the soul, the community, the body, the ancestors. Everywhere, healing wasn't just a job. It was identity, but it came at a cost. Not just in risk or isolation, but in burden of knowledge. Healers knew things others didn't. They knew what dying looked like. They knew what pus smelled like. They knew how long a wound could fester before the limb turned black. They knew which sickness would kill within hours, and which would pretend to be gentle before suddenly taking a child in their sleep. And when you carry that knowledge, it changes how you see the world. You stop fearing the wrong things. You stop believing in promises of safety. Because life is fragile. Always. That awareness, the deep, unshakable understanding of life's fragility, became both a curse and a gift. A curse because it isolated you. People didn't want to be reminded of death. They wanted comfort, simplicity, denial, and you couldn't offer that. Not honestly, but also a gift because it made you see what truly mattered. In the ancient world, time wasn't counted in hours. It was measured in harvests, in rains, in how many children survived to adulthood. So when a healer saved even one life, truly saved it, it wasn't just success. It was legacy. That child might grow to lead, to love, to pass on stories, to plant trees, to fight wars or stop them. The ripple of one survival echoed far beyond the healer's lifetime. And many healers knew this intuitively. They didn't write it in journals. They didn't speak it aloud. But in their bones, they felt it. Every life saved mattered in a way words couldn't capture. Still, there were moments when none of that was enough. When no treatment worked. When prayers failed. When every effort ended in silence. And in those moments, a healer wasn't just a fixer. They were a witness. The last hand held. The last voice heard. The last one present in the fading light. That kind of presence. It leaves marks. And yet many kept going. Because if they didn't, no one else would. In medieval Europe, healing became more formalized, but also more dangerous. Monasteries held medical texts, often copied from the Greeks and Romans. Some monks became skilled in treating wounds, making balms, performing basic surgeries. But the church also imposed limits. Illness was often seen as punishment for sin, and treating it too aggressively could be viewed as interfering with God's will. So the healer had to walk yet another line between faith and reason, between care and blasphemy. Too much success? You were suspicious. Too much failure? You were useless. And the presence of women in healing, midwives, herbalists, folk doctors, became increasingly threatening to authority. Many of them were eventually branded as witches, not because they harmed, but because they healed without permission. They used nature. They worked alone. They knew the secrets of birth and pain and death. And for that, they were feared. Feared enough to be hunted. Thousands were burned or drowned or hanged. Not because they were evil, but because they were powerful in a world that feared female power. It's one of history's cruelest ironies. Those who gave life were so often punished for it. And yet, even that didn't stop the healing. Underground, in whispers, in songs, in coded recipes, the knowledge survived. Passed mother to daughter, elder to apprentice, hidden in kitchens and gardens and forest paths. Because healing, at its core, is unstoppable. It's a human instinct, a defiance of decay, a refusal to surrender, and it will always find a way. Let's go to the battlefield. Imagine the healer not in a village, but in the middle of war. There's blood everywhere, screams, mud mixed with guts, Horses bolt past, eyes wide with terror. The dead and dying are scattered across the field like broken dolls. And you, the healer, run from body to body. You don't have time to think. You pack wounds with moss or cloth, bind limbs with rope, break arrows and pull them free with your bare hands. No anesthesia, no antiseptics, just speed, instinct, and raw will. You're choosing who lives and who dies not because you want to, but because you must. One man is choking on blood. Another is missing a leg. Another begs for water. You only have 2 hands. This moment is as old as time. From the deserts of Mesopotamia to the forests of Europe, from the rice paddies of ancient China to the riverbanks of India, war always brought wounds. And wounds always brought healers. They weren't soldiers, but they were just as brave, because they entered the war without weapons, only with hope, and hope can be more dangerous than steel. Many battlefield healers died before they finished their work, struck by arrows, crushed by retreating horses, killed by soldiers who mistook them for enemies or simply didn't care. Others were taken prisoner, tortured, forced to heal the enemy under threat of death. And still, some volunteered, because the need was too great, because they believed even one saved life was worth it, and because deep down they understood the strange paradox. The place most full of death was also the place where healing mattered most. But healing after war? That was a different pain. You come home, hands still stained with blood, eyes hollow. The world is quiet now, but your mind isn't. You've seen too much, lost too many. You try to help others, but part of you is gone. And no one is coming to heal the healer. In many cultures, war doctors were seen as tools, not people. Used, praised, forgotten. But occasionally, just occasionally, a community would understand. They'd build spaces for healing the healer. Rituals, retreats, silence, time. Because they knew, if the healer breaks, the whole community suffers. And that's a truth that still applies. In ancient times, healing was never just about the body. It was about restoring balance. Between people, between nature and spirit, between past and present. The healer wasn't just a fixer. They were a weaver, threading broken pieces of a world back together. But what happens when the thread itself begins to fray?